we're going to talk about. Not really going to spend a lot of time on CAR T. I can answer questions, but I just at least to say they are now relevant in these space. But I'm going to talk about the history of transplant for follicular lymphoma, mantle cell lymphoma, and T cell lymphoma, explaining where we think we are today and how we got there. And briefly of the agendas, I want to mention again that registry teaches us a lot of information and what you learn from registry and what you can learn from yourself from reflecting on the registry available registry data. And then we'll go through follicular, mantle cell, and T cell very briefly. I got like 15 minutes on each of them. First, with regard to registry, we all know we see these slides all the time, presented in meetings from the CI. This is the CIBMTR, and this is specifically for transplants for lymphoma, Hodgkin's, and myeloma. For it's all autologous, and it's interesting to see that in the blue is the increasing older group over age 65, and from 2000, in the year 2000, this is autologous. Only about 10% were over age 65, and now it's 35% and continually and growing. Well, as I said, you can learn. You see the registry slides, and you can learn. So what we've did 3 years ago, or 2 years ago, something like 2.5 years ago, we decided to look at our own data in context of the registry. And again, it was 10. This is the OHSU, the Northwest Marrow Transplant. In 2000, year 2000, we were doing 14% over age 60. You could see that though earlier than they weren't at 30 to 40% until 2014, but we started by 2010, we were already having an older patient population, the oldest being 41% of patients being over age 65. And currently, we're averaging 40% of our patients over age 65 for which we offer transplant. This is, again, um, all autologous. If we look at this is registry data, it didn't come around right, but you can see this is registry time trends in survival of autologous transplant for lymphoma. And for most of them, at 3 years, you have 80% survival. Well, we mimic that and looked at our survival of follicular lymphoma, and it's 80% survival. And also looking at the years, we don't see much change for auto. If we looked at mantle cell lymphoma, you can look at autologous versus allogeneic transplant from the registry, 5,000 patients, 1,100 patients. Well, we're 47, and actually it's more than 5 now. But you can also see that our numbers, our curves look similar. And the same thing is with, and this is by trends in survival over time between 2000 to 2018. Slowly but surely, we are improving our outcomes. From here to here, it's small, it's statistically significant, and we also could see the same at OHSU. So this was important for us because we always look at the registry slides, but can we learn from them? And when you have enough patient population, it's a good quality control to compare your own outcomes to what is happening across the world. And of course, when I look at our data, is again, we appear to have older patients and maybe more sicker, but um, that's not the issue. What you want to do is to make sure that you're at least equivalent and offering adequate outcomes. If you have worse outcomes than what should be happening, that's when you have to do a deep dive of your own program to say, am I doing the right thing? It's also important to recognize when should people come to you, and there are guidelines, and we tell people, well, call us anytime. But there are now published guidelines from 2017 about how you time consultation. And, like, for instance, for follicular lymphoma, they don't have to see, not every patient with follicular lymphoma has to see a transplant physician. But if they have a poor response to initial therapy, if their initial remission is less than 1 year, anytime at first relapse, or if they transform to large cell lymphoma, they all should be referred. Mantle cell, the recommendation is mantle cell at diagnosis should be referred for consultation, as well as high risk lymphoma. We try to take this and send this message because if you wait, sometimes you fall behind. It's better to get the patients up in your office first and make the appropriate diagnosis and begin the shared treatment plan, because we're not going to treat all these patients. They're going to be treated in their home city by their own home hematologists, but we want to have the relationship established so we can intervene at any given time and be ready to move. So I was going to move next as a request was, what about other lymphoma? Well, follicular lymphoma is the other big one to talk about. 75,000 cases of lymphoma in the United States every year. About 25,000 to 30,000 is large cell lymphoma. Another 25,000 is follicular lymphoma. Those two diagnoses make up 2/3 of the lymphoma that we need to think about. As far as it is, the current bottom line message for is that follicular lymphoma who have early treatment failure, and now currently it's defined as a relapse or progression within 2 years, not 1 year, within 2 years. If they undergo autologous transplantation, you could do it safely with a low treatment related mortality and with excellent over 5 years at 70% compared to historical control, which is 50%. So this is about autologous transplant. And most of what I'm going to talk about is autologous transplant or follicular. That being said, surprisingly, not a lot of patients get referred for follicular lymphoma, um, because in the community they have so many choices, and everyone stays and keeps treating them with a one regimen, the next regimen, the next regimen, to the point there's so many regimens in they're no longer candidates for auto. But the data to say that we really should be doing more autologous transplants for follicular lymphoma. And interestingly, the difference between large cell lymphoma and follicular lymphoma, you can have a disease population resistant to primary therapy, but still get an excellent 5 year survival with autologous therapy by dose escalation. Well, what I wanted to do is go back and where did it all start? So, allogeneic transplants have been going on for 60 years now. It turned out in autologous transplants were not introduced until the early 1980s, when it was saying, we may every we don't not everyone's going to get a donor transplant, but aren't there diseases where chemotherapy escalation can cure a disease? And this is one of the Gordon Phillips, at Washington University, reported one of the very first series. 27 patients, combined Hodgkin's and non-Hodgkin lymphoma, all refractory. They did autologous transplantation, and what they did is they cured 20% of those patients. There's no risk stratification. This is very primitive, but it was probably one of the first indications that you could cure patients just by dose escalation chemotherapy. One of the big surges in the activity of the 1980s, and I was sort of part of, like, around all the laboratories were doing this, is purging. Well, follicular lymphoma, we know involves the bone marrow because 90% of patients with follicular lymphoma are stage 4 in presentation. So could we purge it? And could we clean up the marrow, so guaranteeing that there is no lymphoma in the marrow before transplant? And so what we did is there was a series of studies and all through the 1980s, and this is like some of the summary of like one of the studies that looked at the outcome of follicular lymphoma compared to conventional therapy. This is overall survival. And you could see transplant was superior for contributing to survival, but all of the effort in purging didn't make a difference. Those patients still had basically you could purge the lymphoma out of the bone marrow, but the lymphoma that's left behind in your body is more than enough to overcome and cause relapse. And that's for overall survival. The right is progression free survival. Now, one of the big questions, this is one of the first studies that used, and by the way, these studies were in the absence of rituximab. Now, what we see is rituximab has now entered the arena, and we're saying what happens for follicular lymphoma is at the time of first relapse. This is a clinical trial where they were recommended to go to autologous transplant. If they could, but if they were felt that they weren't capable, it wasn't randomized. It was a patient selected or physician selected, can't go to transplant. But if they didn't go to transplant, they got a maintenance therapy. You could again see that transplantation at the time of first relapse was associated with statistically almost significant overall survival and event-free survival. Again, saying high dose chemo makes a difference. Well, a couple of groups. Julie Vos was at the University of Nebraska, was one of the leading lymphoma people in the United States, was ASCO president a number of years ago. But her group, as well as a group from Boston, shared with the Dana Farber and St. Bart's in London. This was John Gribben leading this effort. They looked at the question: when should we do follicular? When do we get our best benefit? Well, you could see their data was showing that if you wait till 3 or 4 regimens, which is the standard often in the community, I could do this, I'll do this next, I'll do this next. If the longer you wait, the less benefit you get. And in both cases, survival was better if you offered autologous transplant early, either as consolidation of first line or second line, but waiting to third line or more, you had a drop off of benefit. What about rituximab? Well, rituximab is now entering the treatment of lymphoma up front. Well, there's a study to ask, and this was a study in patients who never had rituximab. They're asking for patients who had relapsed chemosensitive follicular lymphoma, could they get just like we offer maintenance therapy to a treatment now of follicular lymphoma, could a patient benefit after autologous transplant with rituximab maintenance? And there showed a definite improvement of progression-free survival. So suggesting, and a lot of people will still do an autologous transplant and consider rituximab maintenance after transplantation. We really don't have a good randomized study in the setting of modern era of rituximab. Um, so one of those in the background, by the way, was always the question about allogeneic transplant. I will come back to allogeneic transplant, but one right in that same time period, as we're trying to figure out how to do autologous transplant, someone reminded us that allogeneic transplant has a big benefit. And because now have the 1418 translocation that can be followed by PCR. And you could see they did a transplant and they would see reduction of the actual PCR signal, but then there was relapse. And they got treated to treatment and got PR, but then they could receive donor leukocyte infusions. So these are lymphocytes from the donor and given in the absence of immune suppression to cause a graft versus host like response with an associated graft versus lymphoma effect. And you could see they introduced the PCR negative state, confirming, similar to allogeneic transplant in AML, that a graft versus lymphoma effect is highly sensitive for follicular lymphoma, and particularly the 1418 translocation to measure it. Getting into that question of allogeneic transplant, there's always a sense that, well, autologous may not be curative. Allogeneic, because we now know there's a graft versus lymphoma effect, that should be curative. So maybe we should be doing more allogeneic transplants in the relapsed patient instead of autologous patients. Well, what happened is this is a study from MD Anderson. Well, it started MD Anderson, then was evaluated in the CIBMTR, and then ultimately again in the European Blood and Marrow Transplant Group, looking at auto versus allo, and could show no difference. And again, it's not a surprise because what we did is we found that allogeneic transplants, there's no, you can see the autologous curves are coming down. The allogeneic curve is a plateau. Well, we're curing these patients, but we also lost 30% of our patients inside of the first 6 months due to graft versus host disease or other non-relapse mortality. Takes 3 years to catch up from the early death. And so for the first 5 years, there's no detectable benefit of allo over auto. If you do go to allo, do you need myeloablative transplant or can you do reduced intensity? Well, the data from the IBMTR and now multiple series show that reduced intensity has an equivalent outcome. As a matter of fact, at MD Anderson, they've piloted using just a classic FCR, fludarabine, cytoxin, and rituximab as the um, conditioning for an allogeneic transplant, showing excellent long-term outcomes. This sort of says the same. What about transform when you get to large cell lymphoma? When you transform large cell lymphoma, maybe that patient should all get an allo transplant. Well, again, there's a Canadian retrospective series that looked at nearly 175 patients. And again, at 5 years, you can't really show a difference of a benefit of allogeneic transplant over autologous transplant, even in the transform setting. So we routinely will do when we have a Richter's transformation or a large cell transformation, we'll try to do an auto transplant first and save allo for future. Um, this is to show that allo, we have gotten better. We did lose a lot of patients early, but survivorship is getting better. But again, if you have sensitive disease versus refractory disease, you're more likely to do better, and that's obvious across all of transplant. As I showed you earlier, I just showed you up front that we're increasingly doing patients over age 65. 40% of all of our autos are over age 65. What about allogeneic transplant? Well, this was a study from the CIBMTR looking at all lymphoma, and what they showed is when you compare the 55 to 65 group to over 65, there's zero difference in outcome in progression-free survival and overall survival. And so, if possible, again, using non-myeloablative or reduced intensity conditioning, you can actually offer allogeneic transplant to an older patient with lymphoma, the appropriate patient, and expect to provide a curative option. So, the American Society, now it's Transplant and Cell Therapy, ASTCT, but the ASBMT originally published their guidelines for follicular lymphoma. This is 10 years ago, where they show that auto transplant will improve progression free survival and overall survival as salvage in the pre Rituxan. It's recommended for transformed. At the moment, because of the advent of Rituxan, they no longer recommend it as first line therapy consolidation. They recognize that allo has a role, but there are competing risks and selection bias. And therefore, if you do use allo, think about reduced intensity conditioning. Well, this is the updated data from the ASB and now ASTCT, where you can see this is their code that auto transplant is not, nothing is recommended in first clinical remission. If you have a refractory disease up front, um, if you have refractory disease up front, you could think about allo. But if it's chemotherapy sensitive, don't do an allo there. You could think about there the standard of care is to do an auto. If you have that patient who relapses inside of 24 months, in its sensitive disease, don't do an allo, do an auto. And then you get into where allo has a role is resistant disease or advanced disease. And what you want to do is you can identify an autologous transplant where you shouldn't do it in follicular is resistant disease, either in clinical remission, in resistant disease, or if you've had a prior auto transplant, there's not a role for a second. Now, just to finish the follicular lymphoma section in the next 3 or 4 minutes, as I was saying, we see data now that tells us, or if you're going to do an auto transplant, you should do it in the after second or third line therapy. Well, this is a study of looking at how we treat um, patients with follicular lymphoma. These are all non-transplant options, chemo options, antibody options, small molecule options. And these are all available to our referring hematologists. This is a paper published in 2018. When someone comes in, here's first line, second line, third line, fourth line, fifth line. Rituximab in 20%, rituximab and chemo, this being mostly bendamustine and rituximab with 60% of patients. You could see or it could be RCVP, but you know, people don't do transplants. You could see in second line, it was only 2%. In third line, only 3%. It wasn't until you get to fourth or fifth line that you have 15% of the patients getting transplant. So people aren't, even though the data support it, the people don't come. And that's still a message that we've got to learn to get to our people. Now, I just also want to just briefly talk about CAR T. CAR T is now approved in the United States and in Europe for follicular lymphoma. Axicabtagene and tisagenlecleucel both have the approval. Just to show you, these are some slides I have from a presentation with the tisagenlecleucel studies. I was part of all the tisagenlecleucel studies. If you look at patients who get follicular lymphoma, we talked about when do you see first line, second line, third line. First line therapy, median time to next need of another therapy is almost 5 years. Second line, a year and a half. Third line, 1 year. Fourth line, 11 months. Fifth line, 6 months and less. So we start to lose durable responses. This is when we should be doing autologous transplants. This is when patients are being referred. Well, they did run a global trial called the ALARA trial, very similar to how they ran the large cell Julia trial, but they were looking for advanced relapse refractory follicular lymphoma, grade 1 through 3A. 3B was treated as large cell lymphoma, so no 3B. They got lymphodepleting therapy and they got their CAR T therapy. Look at the data from CAR T. This is even better than what we saw in large cell. Large cell is so aggressive, it often outgrows the CAR T. But 68% of patients reached CR with an 86% overall response rate. And if you look at the likelihood of being in continuing response at 1 year, it was over 70%. This was published earlier this year in Nature Medicine. And as I recall, most of the patients had a median of 4 to 5 lines of therapy. So now we have 70% of the patients in ongoing response at 1 year, as opposed to by fifth line therapy, we expect the median time to progression of under 6 months. And so there's great future for CAR T for follicular lymphoma, but either way, follicular lymphoma is underutilized, is under-recognized as a reason to send patients for transplant and as a reason to send patients for CAR T. Anyways, going on to mantle cell lymphoma, where we were and where we are today. These are the guidelines. I just showed you the ASBMT guidelines for mantle cell lymphoma. In CR1, definitely auto transplant standard of care, even sensitive primary disease, first relapse sensitive or second or greater relapse sensitive disease. Not recommended for resistant disease for autologous. Now, we wouldn't necessarily expect, why are we recommending that there's clinical evidence for mantle cell lymphoma in first remission or first partial remission? Well, this includes patients with mantle cell leukemia or P53 positive mantle cell, those very high risk patients that are predicted to fail. There's evidence to say you can actually rescue them effectively with an allogeneic transplant, because mantle cell is exquisitely sensitive to the graft versus lymphoma effect, maybe even more than follicular lymphoma. So the guidelines for when to refer patients and when should you think about transplant, it should follow initial therapy, and the NMDP guidelines do not say auto or allo, because they recognize those mantle cell leukemia or the P53s, maybe one may want to do allo, and they don't necessarily say relapse or refractory. They do suggest that's up to the investigator. That's for the National Marrow Donor Program. The United States NCCN guidelines say auto in CR1 standard of care, allo in CR2. Now, mantle cell lymphoma is a rare lymphoma. It's 4 to 6% of all lymphoma. Median time at age of diagnosis is approximately 65. There's no question that the median survival has improved. 10 to 20 years ago, it's probably closer to 20 years ago, the median survival was 2 to 3 years. That was when people before Rituxan and before auto transplant. Now we expect 7 to 10 years for the median time to first progression. So we're having excellent outcomes from our combination of what we've learned over the last 2 decades, and that's what I was going to review. And basically, in summary of the last 2 decades, rituximab is important. Using Ara-C, like so, for deepening the response is important. Rituximab combination um, in with other biologics may be important because they will get a higher likelihood of MRD negative state. And still, overall, we don't know if it cures people. We may have 10-year progression-free survival. We can't necessarily, and we still don't know if autologous procedure cures. Well, one of the earliest studies done, so this was no Rituxan, and so I remember these studies. The median time, if you offer CHOP to a patient with mantle cell lymphoma, the expected time to um, median survival was 2 to 3 years. When we started doing autologous transplants in first CR after CHOP, no Rituxan, we now saw a median survival at 4 years. So we went from 2 to 3 years to 4 years. Here was a study a few years later showing that at 5 years, the median survival hadn't been reached. But this was just upfront auto in the non Rituxan era. And this is Julie Vos again said, what was the next big thing? So we have rituximab showing us 3 year progression free survival, 55, and now we have a 70% overall survival. Well, MD Anderson developed a more intensive regimen for mantle cell lymphoma called hyper-CVAD. And hyper-CVAD with rituximab, they now were offering a 3 year overall survival of 97%. That's in the absence of transplant. They went on to say, consolidate this. The MD Anderson group did a consolidation of this particular regimen and showed 100, basically on that particular arm, 100% 5 year survival when they consolidated hyper-CVAD with rituximab. So we now go from CHOP to CHOP Rituxan like, and then hyper-CVAD and Rituxan. However, as I said, the median age in this study was 56. The median age of mantle cell lymphoma is 65. When they took hyper-CVAD with Rituxan to older patient population, what they found is half of the patients for whom were targeted to go to transplant could never get to transplant. They either lost the ability to mobilize their stem cells or they had developed comorbidities from the treatment such they could not progress. Hyper-CVAD plus rituximab for mantle cell lymphoma is now relegated to the under 60-year-old. That being said, um, we now have another regimen that was developed that has now pretty much replaced the role of hyper-CVAD, which is introducing Ara-C. And there's a study that compared R-CHOP, and this is for induction therapy prior to transplant, versus R-CHOP alternating with R-DHAP. That's dexamethasone hydroxytarabine platinum. And you can start to see there's a 30% improvement in progression-free survival with the Ara-C. And when you look at the ability to get to an MRD negative status, mantle cell lymphoma also has a PCR we can follow. That's the 1114 translocation. And you can see that with the DHAP, you now can get you could go from 50% now to 80% of the patients will achieve an MRD negative status prior to transplantation. And if you reach that, you now look at your transplant, you've got 80% of patients alive without progression at 5 years versus if you were MRD positive, you have you start to have late relapse. So you can now stratify. And this leads us to the Nordic trial. The Nordic trial is a really important trial because this is the trial that they use standard beam or beak auto regimen. They use the CHOP alternating with, they use maxi-CHOP, but CHOP alternating with Ara-C based regimen with rituximab, and they have long-term follow-up. And it's now very long-term follow-up. What they showed is, um, if you did not experience molecular relapse, you now have an 80 at 8 years, you have almost over 75% chance of being free of disease, remaining progression-free disease. If you relapsed um, early, you're likely to progress and need something else. But if you even had late relapse, like relapse occurring, molecular relapse at greater than 1 year, you still have a median of over 5 years before you'll have your first progression. Now, we just literally less than a little over 10 years before this study, the median survival was 2 to 3 years. Now we have median progression at median progression at 5 years. What I like is this is a 15-year follow-up of that study. They point out it's important with 15 years out, you can see that the curve continues to fall. We do have a median survival is now over 10 years. We expect people that we treat today to be living beyond 10 years, but the slope of the curve is not going, keeps going down. It doesn't plateau. So that's why at the moment we still don't have evidence that we cure people. We do think increasingly it's important to do molecular monitoring after transplant. And this is following again this mantle cell population. You could see they used for the cohort of patients that they could actually got to after transplant, didn't have early relapse. They followed by measurable residual disease (MRD). No MRD. Only 19 out of 86 patients relapse. If they were MRD positive, you have 39 out of 67 patients. So the relapse rate is so significant. So we now know we have to follow this. And these are the curves. It's easier to see progression free survival on the left, overall survival on the right, that you could see the importance of MRD negative status. And this is the overall, and this is time to molecular relapse, that you'll see that of the patients who are destined to relapse, 50% still relapse, after 4 years. Now, briefly, just to mention it, the next greatest milestone is everything has been upfront for mantle cell. Now, what about at the tail end? What about using maintenance in rituximab maintenance in mantle cell? Mantle cells and intermediate cell lymphoma. We've already proved that rituximab, the Coral trial, proved that rituximab maintenance in large cell lymphoma didn't have a benefit. What about rituximab maintenance in mantle cell lymphoma? Well, was published in New England Journal now 5 years ago, and clearly this is the patients starting around 2 to 3 months after transplant would start rituximab. They would get 18 doses, basically standard dose, 375 per meter squared, every 2 months for 18 doses. So that's 3 years of rituximab. And progression free survival and overall survival were statistically significant and improved. This has now become standard of care at most transplant centers that I know in Europe and the United States. And they also again confirmed the critical importance of MRD negative status. That so this becomes the goal. Now, where are we today in the United States? Well, what we are today is saying, it's actually interesting. It's a dose de-escalation study because we now know MRD is the everything. MRD is what matters. And so there's a study that's out there now, and we're participating in this, where when someone is diagnosed with mantle cell lymphoma or anywhere along the time, you could submit the patient for deep sequencing of the clonotype, the immune globulin clonotype, the clone-seq assay. If a Now the standard of care is to offer a transplant. So if you have evidence prior to transplant of the clonal marker being present, you get a transplant and you get Rituxan. If your clonal marker is indeterminate, where you really cannot tell a signal, the standard of care is to get a transplant. If, on the other hand, remember 80% of patients after the Nordic regimen can reach MRD negative status, you get this is the de-escalation. If you are MRD negative, you will be randomized to a transplant of rituximab, that's standard of care, or rituximab maintenance only, where transplant may happen at time of relapse. This is a study that's ongoing. We do not have an answer, but this is the first in lymphoma, the first de-escalation trial that we've seen in transplantation. And again, the objectives is to compare the 6-year overall survival of the MRD negative who received the transplant versus those that just get maintenance only. And similar trials are ongoing in Europe, looking at this issue of de-escalation with maintenance. And here they use a lenalidomide maintenance. Allogeneic transplant, just to briefly mention, it does cure patients. This is one of the early studies of patients who had failed an autologous. Most of the patients had failed a prior auto transplant. They're high risk, but you get at least you see that for progression free, I don't know, it's always the right hand curve, but that's 5 years. We only had one relapse after 5 years. There's data from the IBMTR showing that if you take patients to auto transplant, that you do get, maybe it's not so well. Again, you lose a lot of patients in year one to treatment related mortality. But after that, you know, the curve starts to change and you actually start to almost get a plateau, but you have 30% of patients alive. So you can rescue patients effectively. Last slide on mantle cell, CAR T cells. Again, this is the CAR T data from this is the brexticabtagene paper. This got published last year in JCO. And again, this is the patients who are just look at overall survival. These are heavily treated patients. These patients have mostly failed auto transplant, mostly multiply relapsed. Most of them, they've had to have failed the BTK inhibitor also. And what we could see is in all comers, we had 40% of patients alive at 3 years and beyond. Again, not necessarily expected. Right now, mantle cell, CAR T for mantle cell is a very big booming activity in the United States. So
Mhm.
it's 5:40. I'll try to finish T cell lymphoma in the last 5 to 10 minutes. I'm again looking at the Canati et al. If you look at T cell lymphoma, auto for sensitive disease, not for resistant disease, allo, you could justify across the board in T cell lymphoma for refractory or sensitive disease. Does that mean we do it like in early? Doesn't mean we do it. It means it could be an acceptable standard of care. You'll choose what to do. There's been one of the first studies looking at auto transplant as first line, consolidation. They had different, anaplastic, autoimmune T lymphoblastic, um, um, PTCL. This is their upfront regimen. 2/3 the patients got to transplant, and what they show is as first line for PTCL, 3-year overall survival 50%, and progression free also the same. So better than what we would have typically expected. For those of you who may not remember large cell lymphoma, we expect 60% of patients in remission at, in first clinical remission with CHOP. Um, we expect only 30% with CHOP to get into remission. Here we now are up to 50%. And this was in 2009. This is before the development of CHOP plus etoposide as a standard regimen. So we've now improved progression-free survival. And again, when you look at overall survival compared to patients who were not transplanted because of they chose not to because of medical comorbidities or progressive disease, non-randomized. Um, Overall survival was superior to standard of care. There's a study from lymphoma from the Nordic using a dose escalated with CHOP, adding a topicide, um, followed by transplant. And what they show now, the overall survival, 120 patients, decent number, at 3 years, 67% of patients alive. Again, better than what we expect. Sonali Smith, you again, allogeneic transplant, you can recommend it, and a lot of people feel the aggressive T cell lymphomas should get an allo transplant, but they recognize there's a selection bias. That I think a good, healthy person with sensitive disease, I'll do an auto, and I'll only the really resistant patients, I'll do an allo. And what she looked at and what she reported within the international registry was actually, if you take all comers, the likelihood of being alive at 5 years was higher with an autologous than with an allo because of the non-relapse mortality and the early death associated. If you did go to allo, and that's the bottom three curves, it does appear that reduced intensity, again, similar to follicular lymphoma or mantle cell, reduce. You don't need a myeloablative transplant. Reduced intensity may give you an effective benefit long term. But I also want to remind, as I say that, T cell lymphomas is a large there's a large mix. So this is a study between MD Anderson and ourselves and one other group where they looked at relapse refractory extranodal NKT lymphoma. I think this is actually pretty, you know, in I don't know if you have this in Thailand. It's pretty in Japan and China. This is a major issue, and you could see allo transplant. These patients all fail with auto, but even allo only gives you about a 25%. They don't get that 60% target, and this is mostly all due to relapse. So, summary autologous transplant, it's moderately better progression-free overall survival than CHOP alone. There's always a selection bias to younger patients, and frail patients were less likely to go on to transplant. Doesn't address the issue of the non-responders in PTCL. There's a big question still. Should we be transplanting everybody in CR? I personally believe so. If you look, there have been some small randomized trials. One says, hey, there's no real benefit. Another says there's a big benefit. They're talking again in the United States, a national trial to introduce um, yet again and answer the question of should everybody get an autologous transplant in first clinical remission. And finally, I don't have any slides on this, but CAR T cell therapy is underway for T cell lymphoma, for relapsed T cell lymphoma. Now, this is hard because the T cells could theoretically, you generate a T cell to see a T cell antigen where you have the term called fratricide. The worry is the CAR T cells will kill themselves. And so a lot of people are engineering the CAR T cells to look at molecules that may be more selective to the T cell lymphoma. Um, there's a interesting study from University College of London from Martin Poulet, where they found a polymorphism in the constant region of the T cell receptor. So it turns out that it's very much like kappa lambda. This polymorphism stratifies um, the outcomes of it stratifies all T cell disease, and 50% of all T cell lymphomas will be sensitive to that CAR T. That is now they've taken it from a institutional study, and that's going to be now an industry's licensed that, so that'll be emerging. And of course, there's a lot of studies going on with CAR T to genetically alter it so it doesn't kill itself. So finally, I'm just going to show you that we actually recently decided to look at our own experience in allogeneic transplant and autologous transplant in T-cell lymphoma. This includes the variety of diseases that you see, including the rare ones like enteropathic T-cell lymphoma or cutaneous anaplastic. The autologous was typically done in first line. Only 40% were done in salvage. But in the case of allo, only 8% got it up as first line therapy. That was for the NKT lymphoma or the extranodal. Median lines of therapy prior to transplant was 1 versus 3 for allogeneic transplant. You could see the disease status: 25% not in CR for auto, 60% not in CR for allo. Well, what are our outcomes? It's small. They're not, but we cannot show a statistically significant difference in our allo versus auto survival. And we're now, you look at the x-axis. We have This is a 20-year study that we're publishing now. Allo can cure people. We have these long-term measures, so can auto. But it is the longer you follow, there's your 5-year point. And yeah, again, but the allo is being used for the worst case scenario, not for the good risk patients. If you look at our this is based on our disease. Really couldn't show one disease being worse than another statistically different, but that's probably small numbers. But no surprising, anaplastic large cell seems to do better, trends to doing better. And this again matches up with the IBMTR. And so this is for allo. As I said, follicular and mantle cell are the two most disease, are of lymphoma, the most sensitive in graft versus lymphoma. Well, PTCL also has that graft versus lymphoma effect. Hodgkin's comes next, and large cell is worse, often related to the kinetics of large cell, that the large cell will outgrow your ability to develop a graft versus lymphoma effect. All right. Thank you.
Thank you very much,
So
Richard.
you asked for lymphoma. I don't know if that's what you expected, but that covers, a sort of sharing where we were, how we got to where we are today, recognizing that 85% of all lymphoma transplants are autologous, only 15% are allo. We do expect, though, that with CAR T, that allo transplant number percent will probably drop, and we will see allo transplants being used to rescue failed CAR T.
Mm. So thank you very much, Richard, for your comprehensive and very informative talk as usual. So I think for the treatment of the follicular and mantle cell lymphoma seem to be improved very much, but for T cell lymphoma, I think it's still a problem. I have
It's very much a problem.
yeah. So, to your opinion, what is the best conditioning regimen? I think beam versus TBI and sign.
For auto transplants for T cell lymphoma,
Yes, auto and auto.
yeah. For we use Beam. If someone has like cutaneous T cell lymphoma, we've used that's when we've used TBI, or we've done a Beam with cutaneous, where with total electron beam. And we've had a few patients who've had the cutaneous disease, and so we give 1 month before for 2 weeks. We give them 2 weeks of total electron beam, let it settle down for 2 weeks, then we go into auto transplant. You with the beam regimen. Um, we don't do a lot of Cy TBI for. We do no Cy TBI for auto. For allo, again, looking at the data for reduced intensity, and recognizing that many of those patients, unless they have CNS involvement, we'll often use fludarabine melphalan conditioning. Preferentially, I think.
How about
Currently, that's our number one regimen.
Yes, yes. Thank you, thank you. How about the use of the role of maintenance therapy after transplant?
In T-cell lymphoma,
T cell lymphoma. Yes.
we don't offer it. I mean, I know this in anaplastic large cell with that CD30 positive, there are data to support using brentuximab, but that's the only one.
Mm-hmm.
Just like in Hodgkin's, you would do, there's definitely strong data. That's the Athera trial of using brentuximab um, for after auto transplant for Hodgkin's lymphoma. I didn't talk about Hodgkin's because I knew I wasn't going to have any time to do that. But for anaplastic large cell, the number of patients that's highly responsive up front. So if you get to CR with ALCL 30 CD30 positive, we don't offer an auto transplant until they relapse. But then that'll be second. We'll do an auto in CR2 and use brentuximab maintenance there.
How about the role of the immune checkpoint inhibitor in T cell lymphoma?
We've used it for relapse after transplant. Like
Mm-hmm.
we've used that's what we haven't used. We don't use them standard for as a maintenance regimen.
I mean, in for
For
induction.
induction,
Yes.
we still at our center we still use chemotherapy. So we use CHOP for much of the lymphomas. For NKT lymphoma, um, we may start with CHOP for a high risk patient. They may get the asparaginase regimen, containing a regimen, but usually we save checkpoints for relapse.
Mm-hmm. In those age over 65 or 70, which
Yeah.
regimen you use for induction?
Um, we usually, well, I think you're right. In those cases, we have sometimes we'll drop to CHOP
Mm-hmm.
and drop the etoposide.
Mm-hmm. Good.
And if it's a CD30 positive, instead of the vincristine, we'll substitute the brentuximab.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Good. Good. So
Does it
I
sound like how you practice?
yes, yes, same, same. But I use I have a patient with T cell lymphoma and he's already 75 years old, and he refused to get the chemotherapy. I use only low dose of doxorubicin
Yeah.
plus immune checkpoint inhibitor. It works very well.
Oh, nice. Yeah. So we have, I have like, we have 4 lymphoma physicians who treat the non-transplant, non-CAR T patients.
Mm,
Like so, the patients who are the older, infirm patients who will never come my way may be treated by one of my colleagues, but I never see those patients.
mm. Another question is about the transplantation in HLH. Have you any experience on that?
In HLH,
Yes.
yes, we have. You know, I think what happens is everybody, the transplant for HLH is usually done too late. Nobody wants to do it, and it's an inflammatory event. There are data from the BMT-CTN um, at that looked at HLH. HLH is a syndrome, multiple different causes, but the earlier application of transplant seems to be important because of the ability to achieve deep immune suppression. You can, like lymphodepleting therapy. To be honest, I think about it. I know everybody wants to use the VP16 dexamethasone regimen
Yes.
as treatment of HLH. I've actually we've done that. I think our group does it. But looking what I've learned from CAR T about fludarabine cytoxin, I don't know why we're not doing, more aggressive regimens like that. Or introducing anakinra into the management of HLH, where we're doing that in CAR T associated HLH. Anyways, I've seen and thought more about HLH now in the last couple of years because of CAR T therapy. In the case of malignancy or infectious disease associated HLH, obviously getting to the underlying disease is important. We don't see it that often, though, honestly.
But you have experience with doing transplant in those patients?
We have, as a
Yeah.
group, we have done some.
Mhm.
I think it tends to be more the younger patients,
Yes.
but
Thank you.
and
Thank you.
yeah, now there's that antibody now, the anti-gamma interferon antibody, and that you can use, and that some people it's extremely expensive, but they've been able to get that too for a rare patient.
Mr. Serpo, I just want to check in here with time. It's top of the hour. I want to boss. Howdy, cop. Morning.
Hi, thank you very much. I think we reached the end of the session for today. And the visit, we are looking forward to hosting you in the next 2 weeks.
The next session will be in Thailand.
Yeah, very good.
Yeah.
Very good.
Any food allergy, Prof?
Oh, for me?
Uh-huh.
No.
Okay. All right.
No food allergies.
Okay.
I gotta say though, I am Western, and I've watched the TV shows about some of the specialties in Thailand, and Southeast Asia, and some of the things I'm not sure I would eat.
Okay. We will give you the common animal things to eat, okay? So don't worry. No weird thing.
Nothing with
Anyway.
8 legs.
Okay. Thank you very much, Prof. We look forward to see you in the next 2 weeks.
So thank you very
Okay.
much, Richard. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank
All
you.
right. We'll talk, Richard. We'll talk soon.
Thank
Hope
you.
so.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye bye, Justin.